Kethvar pressed his six-fingered hand against the viewing port and watched the human ship float in the darkness of space. The vessel looked crude compared to Federation technology, with thick metal plates welded together and engines that burned too bright. The humans called it Liberty Dawn, and it carried 10,000 of their kind toward a new world they planned to make their home. "Such primitive beings," whispered Thielmon, the Federation ambassador who stood beside Kethvar. The tall, blue-skinned diplomat had met over 40 different species during his long career. "Look at their ship. It barely holds together." Kethvar nodded and made notes on his recording device. As the Federation's top expert on new species, he had studied the humans for 3 months from a distance. They had only been in space for 50 years, making them babies compared to the ancient civilizations that ruled the galaxy. Their technology was simple, their weapons were basic, and their social structure seemed chaotic. The Liberty Dawn had been mining asteroids when the Federation fleet appeared around them. Kethvar watched through long-range sensors as the human crew reacted to first contact with aliens. They did not panic or try to run away. Instead, they sent a simple message in mathematical code that meant they wanted to talk. "Curious," Kethvar said to himself. Most species either attacked or hid when they first saw Federation ships. The humans did neither. They waited calmly for contact, as if they had expected this day to come. Captain Jake Morrison commanded the human vessel. Kethvar had studied recordings of the man for weeks. Morrison was 45 years old with gray hair and tired eyes. He had served in something called the Colonial Defense Force before taking command of Liberty Dawn. The humans had many such forces, suggesting they fought each other often. "Prepare the meeting chamber," Thielmon ordered his assistants. "We will follow standard first contact protocols." The meeting chamber on the Federation flagship was designed to make new species feel welcome. Soft lights created a peaceful atmosphere, and the air was filled with calming scents. Representatives from 12 different Federation species waited in the chamber, showing the humans how many friends they could have if they joined the galactic community. Admiral Lisa Carter represented humanity during the first formal meeting. She was a small woman with short brown hair and sharp eyes that seemed to see everything. She walked into the chamber wearing a simple blue uniform and showed no fear when she saw the various alien forms around the table. "Welcome to the galaxy," Thielmon said in perfect human English. Federation translators had learned the language weeks ago. "We come in peace and friendship." "We appreciate that," Admiral Carter replied. She sat down at the table and folded her hands. "What do you want?" "From us?" The question surprised Kethvar. Most species spent hours expressing gratitude for being contacted by advanced civilizations. They begged for technology and protection. The humans simply asked what the Federation wanted in return. Thielmon explained the standard agreement. Humans would receive protection from hostile forces, access to basic Federation technology, and trade opportunities with thousands of worlds. In exchange, they would share their resources, accept limits on their military development, and follow Federation laws regarding space travel. "Sounds reasonable," Admiral Carter said after listening to the terms. "But we have some questions." For the next 3 hours, the humans asked detailed questions about Federation history, military capabilities, and political structure. They wanted to know about threats in the galaxy, trade routes, and territorial boundaries. Their questions showed a level of strategic thinking that impressed even Kethvar. Captain Morrison joined the meeting through video link from Liberty Dawn. "Admiral, what about our colonies?" he asked. "We have 12 settlements scattered across 4 systems. Will they be protected under this agreement?" "Of course," Thielmon assured him. "All human territory will be considered Federation space once you join us." The Admiral and Captain exchanged glances that Kethvar found interesting. They were communicating without words, sharing information through subtle facial expressions. Most species needed long discussions to make important decisions, but these humans seemed to understand each other perfectly. "We need time to discuss this with our government," Admiral Carter finally said. Can we have 3 days to consider your offer? Naturally, Thielman agreed. Take all the time you need. After the humans left, the Federation representatives gathered to discuss the meeting. Most were pleased with how easily things had gone. The humans seemed intelligent, but not threatening, advanced enough to be useful, but not powerful enough to cause problems. Kethavar was not so sure. He had noticed things the others missed. The way Admiral Carter's eyes constantly scanned the room, memorizing every detail. How Captain Morrison asked specific questions about Federation military weaknesses disguised as innocent curiosity. The fact that both humans carried small devices they thought no one would notice. Something bothers me about them, Kethavar told his assistant later that day. They are too calm, too prepared. Most species are overwhelmed by first contact. You worry too much, his assistant replied. They are primitive mammals from a small world. What threat could they possibly represent? Kethavar looked out at the human ship again. Liberty Dawn hung in space like a sleeping predator, its crude weapons pointed away from the Federation fleet in a gesture of peace. But something in the ship's design suggested it could fight if necessary. The humans had built their vessel to survive in a hostile universe. 3 days later, Admiral Carter returned with humanity's answer. They would join the Federation, but with conditions. They wanted to keep their military forces, maintain control of their colonies, and retain the right to defend themselves if threatened. Most Federation members had given up their weapons gladly, in exchange for protection. The humans insisted on keeping theirs. 3 months had passed since the humans joined the Federation, and Kethavar found himself assigned to Border Station New Haven to continue studying their behavior. The massive station orbited a gas giant on the edge of Federation space, serving as both a research facility and an early warning post for threats from the unknown regions beyond. Dr. Patricia Bell worked in the station's main laboratory, her brown hair always tied back as she bent over alien artifacts and human technology. She had arrived 2 weeks ago as part of the Cultural Exchange Program, bringing with her an enthusiasm for Federation science that impressed even the most experienced researchers. The quantum resonance patterns are fascinating, she told Kethavar, as they examined a piece of ancient HFY crystal technology. Your people discovered principles we're just beginning to understand. Commander Ryan Hughes ran the station's security department, a position that had been largely ceremonial until recently. He was a tall man with broad shoulders and scars on his hands that suggested he had seen combat before coming to New Haven. Unlike Dr. Bell's obvious excitement about alien technology, Hughes watched everything with careful, measuring eyes. Kethavar had grown comfortable around the humans during his time on the station. They were friendly, curious, and eager to learn about galactic civilization. Dr. Bell asked endless questions about Federation history and science, while Hughes focused on more practical matters like station defenses and emergency procedures. Tell me about the outer regions, Hughes had asked during his first week. What's out there beyond Federation space? Mostly empty systems, Kethavar had replied. Some unexplored worlds, ancient ruins, dead civilizations. Nothing that concerns the Federation. Hughes had nodded, but Kethavar noticed him studying star charts of the region with unusual interest. When asked why, the human commander simply said he liked to be prepared for anything. The first sign of trouble came from a Federation patrol ship near the void Nebula, a dark region of space where stars were few and sensors worked poorly. The ship reported strange energy readings before losing contact completely. When a rescue mission arrived, they found only empty space and traces of unknown radiation. More ships began disappearing over the following weeks. Cargo vessels, research, ships, even military patrols vanished without sending distress signals. The Federation High Command issued warnings about possible pirate activity, but the pattern was unlike anything they had seen before. Dr. Bell was working late in the laboratory when the station's emergency alarms began blaring. A reactor coolant line had ruptured in the lower levels, flooding the area with deadly radiation. Standard procedure called for sealing the section and waiting for robotic repair teams, but the damage was too severe for remote fixes. "Someone needs to go down there manually," Chief Engineer Carlos Rodriguez announced to the emergency response team. "The radiation will kill anyone in minutes, but we might be able to reroute the coolant flow if we work fast enough." Kethvar watched in amazement as Rodriguez volunteered for what amounted to a suicide mission. The human engineer grabbed a radiation suit and headed for the damaged section without hesitation, ignoring the protests of his alien colleagues who insisted on finding a safer solution. 15 minutes later, Rodriguez emerged from the radioactive zone with severe radiation poisoning but alive. His quick thinking had prevented a reactor meltdown that could have destroyed the entire station. As medical teams rushed him to the hospital wing, Kethvar wondered what kind of species produced individuals willing to die for strangers. "He'll recover," Dr. Bell assured Kethvar later. "Carlos is tough, and our radiation treatments are pretty good these days." "But why did he volunteer?" Kethvar asked. "He could have died." Dr. Bell looked surprised by the question. "Because someone had to, and he was the best qualified. Wouldn't you do the same thing?" Kethvar honestly was not sure. His species valued individual survival above almost everything else. They would have spent days calculating risks and finding alternatives before attempting such a dangerous repair. The idea of immediately volunteering for probable death was completely foreign to him. Meanwhile, Commander Hughes had been conducting security drills with increasing intensity. Human and alien security personnel trained together in combat scenarios that seemed far too violent for a peaceful research station. Hughes pushed them through exercises involving boarding actions, close quarters fighting, and defense against impossible odds. "Why are we training for ship-to-ship combat?" asked Velthari security officer Nithkan, after a particularly brutal session. "The Federation has been at peace for over 2 centuries. "Because peace doesn't last forever," Hughes replied grimly. "When trouble comes, we need to be ready." The other Federation species found Hughes's paranoia amusing. They had grown up in a galaxy where conflicts were resolved through diplomacy and economics rather than violence. The idea that they might need to physically fight seemed as outdated as using stone tools. But Kethvar noticed that the humans trained differently than everyone else. When the alien security officers went through the motions of combat drills, the humans attacked with genuine aggression. They moved like they expected to kill or be killed, treating every exercise as if their lives depended on winning. The mystery deepened when reports arrived from the crystalline territories, home to the ancient HFY civilization, the Crystal. Beings were among the oldest and most advanced species in the galaxy, with technology that bordered on the mystical. Their urgent message to the Federation High Command contained only 3 words translated into common tongue. "They have returned." "Who has returned?" Kethvar asked Dr. Bell when news of the message spread through the station. "I don't know," she admitted, but her face had gone pale. "The HFY don't scare easily. If something has them worried enough to send warnings, it must be serious." Commander Hughes immediately called an emergency meeting of the station's senior staff. Representatives from 6 different species gathered in the conference room to discuss the growing crisis. Ships were disappearing faster now, entire systems had gone silent, and refugee vessels were fleeing toward Federation space with tales of horror that made no sense. "According to the survivors, something is consuming entire worlds," Hughes reported. "Not destroying them, consuming them. The refugees describe living darkness that eats matter and energy both." "Impossible," declared the Andorian science officer. "No known force can literally consume matter in the way described." "Then we're dealing with an unknown force," Hughes replied, "which means we need to prepare for the worst." The meeting broke up with no clear decisions made. The Federation Council would need to study the reports and determine an appropriate response through proper channels. It was the civilized way to handle a crisis, involving committees and debates and careful consideration of all options. But Kethvar noticed that Commander Hughes was already implementing his own preparations. Human security teams began training around the clock, weapons systems were tested and retested, and emergency supply caches appeared throughout the station. Late that night, Kethvar found Dr. Bell still working in the laboratory, her face lit by the glow of a dozen computer screens. She was analyzing the energy signatures detected near the disappeared ships, looking for patterns that might explain what was happening. "Have you found anything?" Kethvar asked. Dr. Bell looked up with tired eyes. "Maybe. The energy readings remind me of something from our old mythology. Stories about things that shouldn't exist." Before Kethvar could ask what she meant, the station's long-range sensors detected something moving through the darkness beyond the void nebula. Something massive and wrong, bending space around it as it approached the light of civilization. The evacuation orders came at dawn, transmitted across Federation space with a priority code that had not been used in over 500 years. Emergency signals reached every inhabited system simultaneously, carrying the same terrible message. Retreat to the core worlds immediately and prepare for species-level extinction. Kethvar stood in New Haven's command center, watching the tactical display as red zones spread across the galactic map like a plague. 17 star systems had gone. Completely dark in the past week, their populations vanishing without a trace. Refugee ships fleeing the darkness brought stories that defied understanding and challenged the very foundations of what the Federation believed possible. "The Arcturus colony is gone," reported Commander Hughes, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was announcing. 3 billion Corvan settlers disappeared overnight. The automated defense platforms are still broadcasting, but there's nobody left to defend. Dr. Patricia Bell worked frantically at her research station, analyzing the data streams coming from the refugee ships. Her usually neat appearance had given way to exhaustion and barely controlled panic. "The survivors all described the same thing," she said without looking up from her screens. "Living darkness that moves through space like water, consuming everything it touches." The first refugee ship had arrived at New Haven 2 days ago, carrying the scattered remnants of a Federation research outpost. The aliens aboard spoke of shadows that moved with intelligence, eating their way through solid matter and leaving behind empty space that hurt to look at. They described how the darkness seemed to learn and adapt, becoming more efficient at destruction with each world it consumed. "It's not just destroying matter," Dr. Bell continued, her voice growing more strained. "According to the sensor readings, it's actually converting organized energy into something else, something that shouldn't be able to exist in our reality." Kethvar felt his 4 hearts beating faster as he processed the implications. His species had evolved on a peaceful world where the greatest natural disaster was seasonal flooding. The concept of an enemy that could literally unmake reality was so far beyond his experience that his mind struggled to accept it as real. But the humans were reacting differently. Commander Hughes had transformed New Haven's security department into something resembling a military command center. Human personnel worked alongside confused alien staff to implement defensive measures that seemed both desperate and carefully planned. Emergency supply caches appeared throughout the station, weapons were distributed to civilian personnel, and evacuation routes were mapped with mechanical precision. "You're preparing to fight," Kethvar observed as he watched Hughes coordinate the station's defenses. "Yes," Hughes replied without hesitation. "Someone has to. But the evacuation orders specifically state that all personnel should retreat to the core worlds. The Federation High Command has determined that resistance is futile." Hughes paused in his work and looked directly at Kethvar. "The Federation High Command has never faced anything like this before. They're doing what seems logical, but logic doesn't always work when you're dealing with something that wants to eat your entire civilization. The tactical display showed Federation fleets abandoning their positions throughout the outer regions, falling back toward the heavily defended systems at the galaxy's heart. Thousands of ships carrying billions of civilians fled before the advancing darkness, hoping that concentrated defenses and ancient technologies could protect what remained of their civilization. But some ships were not retreating. The human vessels are holding position, reported Velthari sensor operator Nithkan with obvious confusion. Their fleet is maintaining a defensive line along the Meridian sector instead of withdrawing. Kethvar watched the display as red dots representing human ships formed a barrier between the approaching darkness and the fleeing Federation forces. It was a gesture that could only delay the inevitable, buying perhaps days or weeks before. The darkness overwhelmed their defenses and continued its advance toward the core worlds. "Why are they doing this?" Nithkan asked. "Their sacrifice will accomplish nothing except to ensure their own destruction." Commander Hughes heard the question and answered without turning from his console. "Because running away doesn't solve problems. It just gives them time to get worse." The first direct contact with the enemy came 3 hours later, when long-range sensors detected massive objects emerging from the darkness near the Void Nebula. The things that appeared defied easy description, looking like organic ships grown, rather than built, their surfaces rippling with patterns that hurt to watch and made seasoned sensor operators sick to their stomachs. "Devourer ships," whispered Dr. Bell, her face pale as she read the ancient texts that had finally provided a name for their enemy. The Zephyr records call them Devourers. They came before 1,000,000 years ago and almost destroyed everything. Yai. Historical records were fragmentary and difficult to understand, written in symbolic languages that required careful translation. But the essential facts were clear enough. The Devourers were older than current galactic civilization, entities from the dark spaces between galaxies that fed on organized matter and energy. They had been defeated once before, but only through the sacrifice of entire species that threw themselves into hopeless battles to buy time for a desperate final weapon. "How were they stopped?" Kethvar asked. "The records aren't clear, Doctor," Bell admitted. "Something about a species that refused to surrender, that kept fighting even when victory was impossible. But that civilization was destroyed in the process. The Devourer scout ships moved through space in ways that violated known physics, bending reality around them and leaving trails of emptiness in their wake. Federation sensors could barely track them, and the readings they did provide suggested that the ships existed partially outside normal space-time. Then came the moment that changed everything for Kethvar. A single human ship, the cargo vessel Liberty Dawn, broke from the defensive line and accelerated directly toward the approaching Devourer scouts. Captain Jake Morrison's voice crackled over the communication channels as his ship charged into certain death. "All Federation vessels, this is Morrison. We're going to hit them hard and see if they bleed. If we don't make it back, tell everyone we tried." The Liberty Dawn opened fire with weapons that seemed pathetically inadequate against the alien horrors approaching them. But something unexpected happened. The crude human missiles and energy beams actually hurt the Devourer scouts, causing their reality-bending fields to flicker and their organic hulls to twist in apparent pain. "Impossible," breathed Nithkan. "How can primitive human weapons affect entities that our most advanced technology cannot touch?" Dr. Bell was studying the sensor readings with growing excitement. "It's not the weapons themselves," she said. "It's something about the humans firing them. The Devourers seem vulnerable to something the humans possess." The Liberty Dawn was eventually overwhelmed and destroyed, but not before proving that the ancient enemy could be hurt. As the ship's reactor exploded in a brilliant flash of light, the Devourer scouts actually retreated briefly before resuming their advance. Commander Hughes immediately began implementing new defensive plans based on what they had learned. If human weapons can hurt them, we need to get humans onto every defensive position in the sector, he announced. And we need to figure out what makes us effective against them. Kethvar found himself assigned to the Federation flagship Unity's Pride as a cultural liaison, helping coordinate between human forces and the mixed alien fleet that was finally accepting the reality of what they faced. But as he boarded the massive vessel, he wondered if they had learned the truth too late. The darkness was coming, and now Kethvar understood that the real terror was not the enemy itself, but the growing realization that only the galaxy's youngest and most primitive species seemed capable of fighting it. The Battle of the Crimson Nebula began when the main Devourer fleet emerged from dark space like a cancer spreading across the stars. Kethvar watched from the bridge of Unity's Pride as sensors registered over 300 enemy vessels, each one larger than a Federation capital ship and radiating energy patterns that made reality itself seem unstable. Colonel Amy Watson stood beside him, representing the human forces that had been integrated into the Federation fleet during the past week of desperate preparation. She was a compact woman with graying hair and eyes that held the kind of hardness that came from seeing too much combat. Unlike the Federation officers who moved with barely controlled panic, Watson remained perfectly calm as she studied the approaching enemy. Estimated time to contact is 47 minutes, reported the Andorian tactical officer, his voice shaking as the magnitude of the threat became clear. Recommend immediate withdrawal to the core worlds. Fleet Admiral Zefton, a crystalline being whose body rang like wind chimes when he moved, considered the tactical situation with the methodical thinking that had served the Federation for centuries. Agreed. All ships, prepare for emergency. Jump to negative, Colonel Watson interrupted, her voice cutting through the bridge chatter with military authority. Human ships are maintaining position. The Admiral's crystal form shifted colors in a display of confusion and frustration. Colonel, your forces cannot possibly stand against an enemy of this magnitude. Tactical withdrawal is the only logical option. Watson turned to look directly at the Admiral, and Kethvar saw something in her expression that made his skin crawl. It was not fear or desperation, but a cold calculation that suggested she had already accepted what was coming and made peace with it. Admiral, with respect, your people have been running for 2 weeks, and the enemy is still gaining ground. Maybe it's time to try a different approach. On the tactical display, the human ships began moving into attack formation, while the Federation vessels prepared for retreat. Kethvar counted 47 human vessels against over 300 Devourer ships, odds so impossible that even attempting to fight seemed like madness. "This is Captain Danny Foster aboard the destroyer New York," came a voice over the communication channels. "All human ships, this is what we trained for. Remember your families, remember your worlds, and make every shot count." The human fleet accelerated toward the enemy with engines pushed far beyond safe limits. Kethvar watched in fascination and horror as ships that had seemed crude and primitive transformed into instruments of focused destruction. Missile pods opened like flower petals, energy weapons charged with dangerous overloads, and the humans prepared to ram their ships into enemy vessels if necessary. "They're going to die," whispered the Velthari communications officer. "They're all going to die for nothing." But Watson heard the comment and shook her head. "Not for nothing. We're going to buy you time to evacuate civilians, and we're going to learn how to kill these things." The first exchange of fire lit up space like a miniature star being born. Human weapons struck the Devourer ships with everything they had, and the enemy responded with energy beams that seemed to eat holes in reality itself. 3 human destroyers vanished in the first volley, simply ceasing to exist as the Devourer weapons unmade them at the molecular level. But the human return fire was having effects that stunned the Federation observers. Crude nuclear missiles were punching through Devourer shields that had shrugged off the most advanced Federation weapons. Energy beams designed for asteroid mining were cutting deep wounds in alien hulls that bent space around them. "How is this possible?" Admiral Zefton demanded. Our analysis suggested that conventional weapons would be completely ineffective. Dr. Patricia Bell, who had been transferred to Unity's Pride as a technical advisor, looked up from her instruments with growing excitement. It's not the weapons themselves, Admiral. It's the intent behind them. The Devourers seem to be vulnerable to aggression directed by beings who have experienced real violence. Kethvar did not understand what she meant until he watched the battle more carefully. The Federation weapons were more powerful and more sophisticated than anything the humans possessed, but they had been designed by peaceful species who viewed violence as an unfortunate necessity. The human weapons were crude by comparison, but they had been created by a species that understood war at the most fundamental level. Lieutenant Helen Brooks led a boarding party from the cruiser Boston directly onto a damaged Devourer vessel, using emergency airlocks to breach the alien hull and fight their way inside. Kethvar watched the helmet camera feeds in fascination and revulsion as the humans advanced through corridors that seemed to be made of living nightmare. The interior of the Devourer ship defied description. Walls pulsed with organic movement. Floors shifted like liquid while remaining solid, and the air itself seemed to whisper threats in languages that predated current civilization. Federation troops would have been paralyzed by the psychological assault, but the humans pressed forward with flamethrowers and explosive charges. Contact front, Brooks reported, as her team encountered Devourer crew members for the first time. The beings that appeared on the camera feeds looked like shadows given semi-solid form, moving through three-dimensional space while somehow occupying more dimensions than should have been possible. The humans opened fire without hesitation, using weapons that seemed almost primitive against enemies that existed partially outside reality. But their shots were having effect, causing the shadow beings to writhe and retreat, as if they were feeling pain for the first time in millions of years. Keep moving, Brooks ordered her team as they carved their way deeper into the ship. Find something that looks important and blow it up. The psychological pressure inside the Devourer vessel was incredible. Kethvar could see the strain on the humans' faces as they fought through an environment designed to drive organic minds insane. But they kept advancing, using a combination of training and sheer bloody-minded determination that impressed even their enemies. When the boarding party reached what appeared to be the ship's central brain, Brooks made a decision that defined the entire battle. Instead of trying to study or capture the alien technology, she and her team simply attached every explosive charge they carried to the pulsing organic computers and set the timers for 30 seconds. Brooks to Boston. Mission accomplished. Tell my family I love them. The explosion that followed was visible from across the battlefield. The Devourer ship twisted in on itself like a dying animal before disappearing in a flash of light that left empty space behind. For the first time since the war began, a Devourer vessel had been completely destroyed. But the cost was terrible. The Boston had been overwhelmed while its boarding party was inside the enemy ship, and 17 other human vessels had been lost in the continuing battle. The survivors were running low on ammunition and fuel, facing an enemy that seemed to learn from each exchange of fire. That was when Major Scott Turner made the decision that changed the course of the war. Turner commanded the heavy cruiser Philadelphia, a ship that had been built for planetary bombardment and carried the most powerful reactor in the human fleet. As Devourer ships closed in on the remaining human vessels, he announced his intentions over the communication channels. All ships, this is Turner. I'm going to overload my reactor and ram the command ship. When I detonate, hit everything in. The blast radius with everything you have left. The Philadelphia accelerated toward the largest Devourer vessel, a biomechanical horror the size of a small moon that seemed to command the enemy fleet. Turner's ship absorbed incredible punishment. As it closed the distance, its hull glowing red-hot from energy weapons that could melt steel in seconds. For Earth, Turner said simply, as his ship struck the enemy command vessel and both reactors went critical simultaneously. The explosion that followed was like watching a star die in fast motion. The combined detonation tore a hole in space-time itself, creating a cascade effect that destroyed 17 Devourer ships and damaged dozens more. The enemy fleet actually retreated for the first time since the war began, pulling back to reassess this new threat. Kethvar stared at the tactical display in shock and awe. The humans had taken impossible losses and faced certain death, but they had proven that the Devourers could be beaten. More importantly, they had shown the galaxy something that had been forgotten for millions of years. Sometimes the only way to defeat monsters was to become something even more dangerous than they were. The war had spread across half the galaxy, and Kethvar found himself stationed aboard the combined fleet headquarters ship Determination, watching as humans taught the rest of the galaxy how to fight monsters. 3 months had passed since the Battle of the Crimson Nebula, and the Federation had learned that survival required them to become something they had never been before. Dr. Patricia Bell worked in the ship's main laboratory, surrounded by alien volunteers who were learning to build weapons designed with human psychological profiles. The technology she had developed required operators who understood violence at an instinctive level, making it useless to most Federation species who had evolved in peaceful environments. The targeting system reads emotional patterns, she explained, to a group of Corvan engineers who were struggling to understand the interface. It identifies targets based on the operator's capacity for controlled aggression. If you approach it like a scientific instrument, it won't respond. Sergeant Joe Parker ran combat training sessions in the ship's cargo bays, teaching alien species how to fight in ways that violated every principle of civilized warfare they had ever learned. Parker was a compact man with scars on his face and hands that spoke of years spent in violent conflicts that most Federation citizens could not imagine. "Forget everything you know about rules and honor," he told a squad of Andorian security officers who were learning to use human-designed weapons. "The Devourers don't care about your ethics. They want to eat your families and turn your worlds into empty space. Your job is to stop them by any means necessary." The Andorians struggled with the concept. Their species had developed advanced martial arts based on discipline and restraint, viewing violence as a necessary evil that should be minimized whenever possible. Learning to fight with the brutal efficiency that humans demanded felt like betraying everything they believed about civilized behavior. But they were learning, because the alternative was extinction. Kethvar had participated in the Battle of Station Omega 2 weeks earlier, and the experience had changed his understanding of both humans and warfare. The Devourer fleet had attacked the critical supply depot with over 100 ships, intending to cut off Federation forces from their logistics network and force them to retreat even further toward the core worlds. Commander Lisa Hayes had led the defense of the station with a mixed force of human and alien ships. She was a tall woman with blonde hair and ice-blue eyes that seemed to see straight through any deception or weakness. Unlike most Federation officers who preferred to command from secure positions, Hayes led from the front and shared every danger with her troops. "All ships, this is Hayes." Her voice had crackled over the communication channels as the enemy fleet approached. "We hold this station no matter what it costs. Every supply ship that makes it through to the front lines means 100 Federation worlds that don't get eaten." The battle had been a nightmare of close quarters fighting as Devourer ships tried to board the station while the defenders fought, them off deck by deck. Kethvar had found himself armed with a human-designed plasma rifle, standing in a corridor with Hayes and a squad of mixed species as shadow beings poured through a breach in the station's hull. "Fire discipline," Hayes had ordered calmly as the aliens approached. "Short bursts, aim for center mass, and don't let them get close enough to touch you." The Devourer creatures moved like liquid darkness, flowing around obstacles and attacking, from angles that should not have been possible in three-dimensional space. But the human weapons were effective against them, and Hayes led her mixed squad with the kind of tactical brilliance that came from years of experience in impossible situations. When a section of the station's hull failed catastrophically, Hayes had personally held the breach with her bare hands until emergency force fields could be activated. The decompression should have killed her instantly, but she had used an emergency pressure suit and raw determination to keep the atmosphere from escaping until her engineers could seal the damage. She had died 3 minutes later from injuries that no medical technology could heal, but her sacrifice had saved over 10,000 civilian refugees who were sheltering in that section of the station. "Why do they do it?" Kethvar had asked Dr. Bell afterward. "Why do humans keep throwing themselves into certain death for people they barely know?" Dr. Bell had considered the question carefully before answering. "Because that's what we are. Every human alive today is descended from people who survived impossible odds by protecting each other. It's built into our genetics and our culture. We don't know how to give up." The psychological profiles that Dr. Bell had developed showed that humans possessed a unique combination of traits that made them effective against the devourers. They had evolved as persistence hunters, capable of tracking prey across vast distances through sheer determination. They had developed as social predators, working together to bring down threats much larger than themselves. Most importantly, they had experience with genuine evil. Most Federation species evolved on worlds where the greatest threat was natural disasters or resource scarcity, Dr. Bell explained to a gathering of alien psychologists. Humans evolved on a world where other humans were often the greatest threat. We understand malice in a way that peaceful species cannot. The devourers fed on fear and despair, using psychological weapons that could drive entire populations to madness and suicide. But humans had already faced their darkest fears and learned to function despite them. War, famine, plague, and genocide were part of human history, making them psychologically immune to the terror tactics that paralyzed other species. Captain Ryan Hughes, now promoted to admiral after the losses at Omega Station, coordinated the defense of the Meridian sector from his flagship Defiance. He had implemented tactics that seemed insane to Federation military doctrine, but were proving effective against an enemy that operated outside conventional understanding. "Ramming speed," Hughes ordered, as a Devourer command ship approached his position. "All ships, target their largest vessel and hit them with everything we have." The combined fleet accelerated toward the enemy with weapons charging and engines overloading. It was a tactic that guaranteed massive casualties among the attackers, but it was also the only way to ensure that some shots would penetrate the reality-bending defenses that protected Devourer vessels. Kethvar watched from the bridge as the Defiance led the charge directly into the enemy formation. Human ships absorbed incredible punishment as they closed the distance, their hulls melting under energy weapons that could unmake matter itself. But they kept coming, firing point-blank into Devourer vessels and ramming them when their weapons failed. The Federation ships followed their example, their alien crews learning to embrace the kind of calculated madness that humans called courage. Andorian destroyers traded broadsides with biomechanical horrors. Corvin frigates rammed shadow ships with their reactors set to overload, and Velthari cruisers fought boarding actions in corridors that defied geometry. When the battle was over, half the Federation fleet was gone, but the Devourer formation had been completely destroyed. More importantly, they had captured intact pieces of enemy technology that Dr. Bell could study to develop better weapons and defenses. "We're learning," Hughes told Kethvar as they surveyed the wreckage of the battlefield. "Every fight teaches us something new about how to hurt them. We just have to make sure we learn faster than they do." But Kethvar could see the cost of the war in the faces of the human survivors. They were winning battles through sheer determination and willingness to sacrifice everything, but each victory left them more scarred and hardened than before. The gentle humans who had joined the Federation 6 months ago were being forged into something else entirely. The question was whether any of them would survive long enough to see the end of the war, and whether the galaxy would recognize them as the same species that had once seemed so harmless and primitive. The final battle began at the galactic core, where the ancient stars burned brightest and reality itself was strongest. The devourer Overmind had established its stronghold among the stellar nurseries where new suns were born, feeding on the raw energy of creation itself to grow stronger with each passing day. Kethavar stood on the bridge of the battleship Indomitable beside Admiral Jake Morrison, watching as the largest fleet in galactic history approached their ultimate enemy. Morrison had survived the destruction of Liberty Dawn and risen through the ranks by never backing down from impossible odds. His gray hair had turned white during the past year of constant warfare, and his eyes held the kind of hardness that came from watching too many good people die. Final sensor sweep shows over 1,000 Devourer vessels protecting the Overmind, reported the tactical officer, a young Andorian who had learned to fight under human command. Energy readings suggest the central entity is the size of a small planet. The combined fleet that approached the galactic core represented every surviving ship from 47 different species. Federation vessels flew alongside human destroyers. Corvin cruisers fought beside Velthari frigates, and ancient Zeph-High crystal ships shared formation with newly built human dreadnoughts. But they were united by more than just military necessity. Dr. Patricia Bell worked frantically in the ship's laboratory, making final adjustments to the weapon that represented their only hope of victory. The device she had created combined human engineering with alien technology, producing something that existed at the boundary between science and madness. "The reality destabilizer is ready," she announced over the communication system, "but it requires a direct connection to the Overmind's central consciousness. Someone has to carry it inside their stronghold and activate it manually." Admiral Morrison studied the tactical display that showed the massive biomechanical fortress surrounding the Devourer Overmind. The structure defied description, looking like a cancer that had grown to the size of a moon and developed its own twisted intelligence. Energy patterns flowed across its surface like blood through veins, and space itself seemed to bend around it in ways that hurt to contemplate. "Volunteer crews only," Morrison announced to the fleet. "We need a strike team willing to fly directly into that thing and plant Dr. Bell's weapon. Anyone who goes in probably won't be coming back." The response surprised even Kethavar, who had learned to expect extraordinary behavior from humans. Over 300 ships volunteered for the suicide mission, including vessels from every species in the fleet. Alien crews who had been peaceful, farmers and merchants a year ago, now competed for the chance to die fighting the galaxy's greatest enemy. Captain Ryan Hughes commanded the strike force from his new flagship Retribution, leading 50 ships selected for speed and firepower rather than survivability. The plan was simple in concept, but impossible in execution. Punch through the Devourer defenses, penetrate the Overmind's stronghold, and detonate Dr. Bell's weapon at the center of the enemy consciousness. "Remember what we're fighting for," Hughes said over the fleet communication system as the final assault began. "Every world that still has children playing in sunlight, every species that wants to see tomorrow, every dream that refuses to die in the darkness." The Devourer fleet moved to intercept them with formations that bent space into impossible configurations. The enemy ships seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, attacking from angles that should not have been possible and using weapons that unmade their targets at the quantum level. But the Federation forces had learned to fight like humans. Corvin destroyers rammed Devourer vessels with their reactors set to overload, trading their lives for massive explosions that cleared paths through the enemy formation. Andorian cruisers used boarding tactics that their species had never imagined, fighting hand-to-hand in corridors where physics failed and nightmare became reality. Velthari frigates coordinated suicide attacks with the precision of their peaceful ancestors but the brutality of their human teachers. Kethvar found himself manning a weapons console aboard the Indomitable, firing human-designed missiles at targets that seemed to exist outside normal space-time. The irony was not lost on him that a peaceful xenobiologist was now actively participating in the most violent conflict in galactic history. The strike force fought its way through 3 defensive layers before reaching the Overmind's fortress. Captain Hughes led the final assault personally, flying his ship directly into the biomechanical structure through an opening that sealed itself behind them. The interior was a maze of organic passages and impossible geometries, but Hughes navigated it with the instincts of a predator tracking its prey. "Contact with the central chamber," Hughes reported as his ship broke through into a vast space at the heart of the fortress. "Beginning final approach now." The Overmind itself was beyond description, a fusion of flesh and technology and pure malevolence that had been growing for millions of years. It reached out with tendrils of living darkness, trying to crush the tiny ships that had dared to penetrate its sanctuary. But the human vessels pressed forward with engines overloading and weapons firing continuously. Dr. Bell's weapon required a direct neural connection to function properly, meaning someone had to physically interface with the Overmind's consciousness while the device was activated. It was a task that would almost certainly drive the operator insane within seconds, but it was the only way to ensure the weapon reached its target. "I'll do it," Hughes announced calmly. "Get me close enough to make physical contact." The retribution accelerated toward the Overmind, with all remaining ships providing covering fire. Hughes fought his way through tentacles of living nightmare and energy weapons that existed outside normal physics, using every trick he had learned during a year of impossible battles. When his ship finally reached the Overmind's surface, Hughes activated his suit's emergency systems and stepped outside into the vacuum of space. He walked across the surface of ultimate evil itself, carrying Dr. Bell's weapon toward a connection point that pulsed with malevolent intelligence. "For everyone who didn't make it this far," Hughes said as he plugged the device into the Overmind's consciousness and felt alien thoughts pouring into his mind like acid. The reality destabilizer activated with a sound that existed beyond hearing, a vibration that reached into higher dimensions and began unmaking the structure of space-time itself. The Overmind screamed in frequencies that shattered matter and tried to reject the weapon, but it was too late. The explosion that followed was visible from across the galaxy, a flash of light that announced the death of something that had terrorized the universe for millions of years. When the brightness faded, empty space remained where the Overmind's fortress had been, and the surviving Devourer ships began fleeing back toward the darkness between galaxies. But the cost had been terrible. Of the 3,000 ships that entered the final battle, fewer than 400 survived. Captain Hughes was gone, along with most of the human officers who had led the war effort. The Federation had won, but at a price that would take generations to fully understand. Kethvar stood in the observation deck of New Earth Station 6 months later, reading the names carved into the memorial wall. Thousands of humans had died to save alien civilizations they had barely known, trading their lives for the chance to protect species who had initially dismissed them as primitive and harmless. Admiral Morrison found him there, studying the list of casualties that seemed to stretch forever. "Do you understand now?" Morrison asked quietly. "Do you see what we really are?" Kethvar considered the question carefully before answering. "You are the species that refused to surrender when surrender was the only logical option. You taught the galaxy that sometimes logic is not enough." Morrison nodded and placed a hand on the memorial wall. "We're the species that learned to be monsters so that others could remain innocent. We did the terrible things that needed doing so that alien children could grow up in peace." Kethvar looked out at the stars, where Federation ships were returning to explore worlds that had been dark for over a year. The Devourers were gone, fled back to whatever realm they had come from, and life was beginning to return to the galaxy. But he would never forget the day he learned that the most terrifying thing in the universe was not the darkness between stars. It was the light that refused to be extinguished, carried by beings who understood that some things were worth dying for. The humans had saved the galaxy not through superior technology or ancient wisdom, but through their willingness to become whatever the situation required. They had faced ultimate evil and discovered that they could be something even more dangerous when protecting those they loved. And in the end, that had been enough.